A lone skier finds something buried under the snow, something that was never meant to be found. A hidden door in the mountains, a mystery frozen in time. What lies beyond it? Stay until the end to find out. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. The wind swept across the upper slopes of Silver Pine Ridge, scattering powdery snow and fine, glittering clouds. Ethan Miller adjusted his goggles and paused to study the valley below, where pine trees leaned under the weight of the recent avalanche. The world was still and silent, a rare calm after days of storms. His breath fogged in the cold air curling around his scarf before vanishing into the whiteness. He loved this kind of solitude, the kind that pressed against the ears and made even thoughts sound too loud. Out here, away from the noise of people, Ethan could almost forget the image that still haunted him. His younger brother Noah swallowed by an avalanche 3 winters ago on a nearby slope. Since then, skiing alone had become his quiet ritual of remembrance and survival. That morning, he had left Aspen Creek before sunrise, driving his old pickup through narrow roads lined with frost. The avalanche had come down 3 days earlier, and the Forest Service had warned that conditions remained unstable, but Ethan's curiosity often pushed him beyond the cautious boundaries others obeyed. He had heard from a ranger that the avalanche was unusually deep, tearing away layers of rock and ice that had not been exposed in decades. That alone was enough to draw him higher up the ridge. As he carved a careful line down through the untouched snow, a glint caught his eye, a brief flash of light somewhere in the scarred path left by the avalanche. He slowed, puzzled, and stopped where the snow had thinned. For a moment, he thought it might be a piece of old mining equipment, maybe debris from the abandoned tunnels that dotted these mountains. But as he approached, stepping out of his skis and trudging through the crusted drifts, the reflection appeared again, sharp and deliberate. He brushed away a patch of snow with his gloved hand and froze. Beneath the ice lay a broad metal surface, dull with rust, but unmistakably artificial. His pulse quickened. He scraped away more snow until the edges appeared. A rectangular outline embedded in concrete, almost like a doorway. The frame was heavy, industrial, with faded stenciled markings that had long since lost their color. Ethan crouched, tracing the frozen grooves with his fingers. It was old World War II era, maybe earlier. What was something like this doing here, high above any known road or trail? He looked around instinctively, as though someone might be watching. Only the wind answered. For a moment, he considered leaving it untouched. After all, there were stories about old bunkers and test sites scattered throughout the Rockies, relics of forgotten experiments. But curiosity tugged harder. He pulled out his phone and took several photos, zooming in on the markings, then tried the door handle. It didn't move. The hinges were fused solid. The quiet pressed in again. He imagined what might be behind it. Storage, tunnels, or maybe nothing but collapsed stone. He had learned long ago that the mountains like to keep their secrets buried. Still, something about this discovery felt different, more deliberate. A man-made door sealed into solid rock was not something nature built or easily forgot. Ethan stood for a long while, letting the thoughts settle. The sensible part of his mind whispered that this was beyond him. If it was a government structure, it could be dangerous. He could already picture the headline. Local skier triggers collapse exploring old bunker. He gave a humorless laugh, shaking his head. Then he turned his gaze toward the distant ridges glowing orange in the late sun. Somewhere out there, his brother's grave lay under unmarked snow. "You'd tell me to check it out?" Ethan murmured under his breath. By the time he reached the base of the slope, twilight was falling. He radioed the ranger station in Aspen Creek, his voice steady but urgent. "This is Ethan Miller," he said. "I was up near Silver Pine Ridge, the north face above the avalanche cut. There's something up here you'll want to see. Looks like a buried structure big, made of concrete and steel." There was a pause on the other end, the faint crackle of static. Then a calm voice replied, "Copy that, Ethan. Stay clear of the site. We'll send a team in the morning." He nodded to himself, though no one could see him, glancing back toward the ridge. The fading light painted the mountains in shades of blue and violet. Whatever he had found was waiting there, silent beneath the snow. He strapped his skis to his pack and began the long descent toward the valley, each turn carving a clean line through the untouched powder. Beneath the serenity, though, a strange unease followed him. an instinct that something hidden had been disturbed, something meant to stay buried. That night, as he sat by the fire in his small cabin, Ethan reviewed the photographs on his phone. The door looked even stranger in the artificial light, edges sharp symbols half erased. The number 47 barely visible beneath layers of rust. He enlarged the image until it blurred and stared at it for several minutes. There was a pattern to the decay, like the mountain itself had tried to swallow the door hole. He poured himself a cup of coffee that had gone cold and stared through the window at the snow swirling outside. Tomorrow, the authorities would arrive. Whatever this was, he would soon have answers. Outside, the wind howled down from the peaks, erasing his ski tracks one by one. The ridge slept under its new blanket of snow. But deep within, behind that silent door, the air shifted ever so slightly, as if something, somewhere in the mountain's heart, had felt the first breath of winter after decades of darkness. The next morning dawned cold and brittle, the kind of mountain light that made every edge sharp and every breath sting. Ethan Miller stood at the base of Silver Pine Ridge, watching as the first convoy of vehicles crawled up the snow-packed road. The rescue team had arrived earlier than expected, joined by a few men in unmarked military uniforms. Their leader introduced himself as Captain Robert Hayes, his voice calm but firm, the tone of someone used to command. Hayes had the weary eyes of a man who had seen too many places where nature and human secrets met badly. He listened closely as Ethan described how he had found the door, occasionally glancing toward the slope where the avalanche had stripped the mountain bare. When Ethan showed him the photos, Hayes nodded once and ordered his team to prepare the equipment. By midday, the path up to the site was clear enough for the team to carry generators and heavy cutting tools. Ethan followed, feeling both anticipation and unease tighten inside him. The wind had changed direction, whispering through the trees with a low, restless sound. The area around the buried structure looked different in daylight. What had seemed like an isolated patch of concrete now revealed hints of a larger shape beneath the snow, perhaps part of a wall or foundation. The door itself stood tall and silent, framed by cracked concrete and streaks of rust that ran like veins down its surface. Hayes studied it for a long moment before turning to his crew. "Let's open it," he said quietly. The men set to work. Sparks leapt from the metal as cutting torches hissed through the frozen air. The smell of burning steel mixed with the cold, creating an unnatural taste on Ethan's tongue. He kept his distance, but couldn't look away. Hours passed as the noise of machinery echoed against the cliffs, each clang bouncing down into the valley. Then, with a heavy groan, the hinges shifted. The door moved an inch, then two. And finally, with one last wrench, it opened inward. A wave of air poured out, stale, dry, and cold as stone. It smelled faintly of oil, dust, and something older that none of them could name. A beam of light cut through the darkness as Captain Hayes stepped inside, his flashlight trembling slightly in the still air. "Stay here," he said, his voice echoing faintly from within. Ethan watched the narrow circle of light move deeper until it vanished around a bend. The minutes dragged on. The only sounds were the crackling of ice and the distant creak of metal expanding in the cold. Someone coughed nervously. Ethan felt the pressure of the mountain around them as though the earth itself was listening. Then suddenly, footsteps thundered from within. Hayes emerged at the doorway, his face drained of color, his breathing ragged. "Back away," he barked. "Get everyone out. Evacuate the ridge." His words sliced through the air with such force that no one hesitated. The men dropped their tools and began retreating down the slope. Ethan's heart hammered as he stumbled backward through the snow, trying to make sense of what he'd just seen. The captain's eyes looked wild, not afraid for himself, but terrified for what lay inside. Within minutes, radio calls were going out to the local authorities. The evacuation zone spread quickly, and the sound of distant sirens began to echo through the valley below. Ethan was guided away by one of the officers, but he couldn't stop glancing back. The open door stood against the white mountain like a wound, black and silent, swallowing the daylight. A small cloud of dust or steam seemed to drift from within, faint but constant, as though the mountain were exhaling after years of holding its breath. When they reached the base camp, Hayes stood apart from the others, talking quietly into a secure radio line. Ethan caught fragments of his words. Unstable ordnance containment. The meaning hit him all at once. This wasn't just a hidden shelter or forgotten mine. Whatever was inside that tunnel had been built for war. The thought chilled him more than the wind ever could. As darkness fell, the ridge was sealed off. Floodlights cast long, harsh beams across the snow, and armed personnel set up a perimeter. The quiet mountain of the morning had become a fortress of urgency and fear. Ethan sat near a heater, hands trembling despite the warmth. He thought about his brother, about how the mountains always took what they wanted, and how humans never seemed to learn when to leave things buried. Hayes approached him once, his expression softer, but lined with exhaustion. "You did the right thing calling us," he said. "But you need to stay clear now. What's in there? It's not safe. Not for anyone." Then he walked back toward the floodlights without another word. Long after the generators quieted and the stars appeared, Ethan remained awake. From the distance came the muffled sound of the mountain shifting, like something ancient stirring beneath layers of ice and time. He realized that by uncovering that door, he had awakened more than just curiosity. He had disturbed the silence of history itself, and whatever that silence hid was now breathing again, waiting in the cold heart of the mountain. By the following morning, Silverpine Ridge no longer belonged to the quiet wilderness. The once tranquil slope had transformed into a restricted zone, buzzing with vehicles, tents, and floodlights. Military engineers moved with precision, their breath visible in the frozen air as they established containment lines. The air smelled faintly of diesel and frost, a cold mix that clung to every surface. Ethan stood outside the perimeter tape, watching the organized chaos unfold. He hadn't planned to return, but something inside him couldn't let go. This mountain had taken his brother and now seemed to hold another kind of danger, one he couldn't turn his back on. When Captain Hayes saw him standing there, he didn't send him away. He simply gave a small nod, a silent acknowledgement that curiosity sometimes had its place beside duty. Later that day, a team of specialists arrived from a nearby military base. They wore protective suits and carried equipment Ethan had only seen in documentaries: radiation detectors, gas sensors, and portable decontamination units. As they descended into the newly opened tunnel, the rest of the crew waited in tense silence. Hours passed. When they finally re-emerged, their expressions were grim. One of them spoke quietly to Hayes, who turned pale. Ethan caught fragments of their exchange: hundreds of devices, unstable compounds, chemical residues. The truth spread through the camp like a cold wind. What lay beneath the mountain wasn't just an old shelter. It was an arsenal. In the days that followed, the investigation deepened. Experts traced faded serial numbers on rusted crates, piecing together a story that seemed pulled from forgotten history. The bunker had been part of a secret World War II project known internally as High Peak. During the final years of the war, engineers had built a hidden network of supply facilities deep within the Rockies, storing munitions, prototype weapons, and experimental devices meant for testing in high-altitude conditions. The Silverpine site had been designed to support an isolated airstrip on the plateau above, a makeshift landing field for transport planes that never saw full operation. When the war ended abruptly, the project was abandoned without record. No one had ever come back to clear the storage or disarm the weapons. Over the decades, snow and rock swallowed every sign of the facility until only the heavy door remained, entombed in silence. The records that might have identified it were lost in a flood at a military archive in the late 1940s. Hayes spent long nights in a temporary command tent, poring over the few surviving maps. This place was never supposed to be found, he muttered once, more to himself than to anyone else. Ethan tried to stay useful, helping with transport and communication between teams. He learned that the bunker extended for hundreds of feet under the mountain, branching into smaller chambers. Inside, the walls were covered with frost, the ceilings dripping with condensation that hissed when it touched old metal. Entire rooms were filled with rows of bombs stacked like sleeping beasts, their shells corroded, their casings leaking faint traces of chemicals into the stale air. The specialists said that even the smallest disturbance could trigger a disaster. The thought made Ethan's stomach twist. The mountain that had once been his refuge now felt like a trap, alive with invisible tension. Every creak of ice sounded like a warning. One afternoon, as the teams carefully removed rusted crates from a lower chamber, a section of the ceiling gave way. The sound echoed through the tunnels like thunder. Dust and smoke burst from the entrance, followed by shouts for help. Ethan ran toward the sound, his boots sliding on the frozen ground. Inside, visibility was almost zero. He followed the beam of his flashlight through the haze until he saw two men dragging a third out of the rubble. The ceiling had partially collapsed, crushing part of the passageway. The rest of the team staggered out behind them, coughing, their faces streaked with grime and fear. The blast had not been an explosion, just the earth shifting under the strain, but the message was clear. The mountain was unstable and time was running out. That evening, Hayes called an emergency meeting. The engineers argued for withdrawal, insisting that any further excavation risked triggering a chain reaction. But Hayes shook his head. If we leave it now, he said quietly, the next avalanche could bury this place again or wake it up. Either way, we won't get another chance. His words silenced the room. Ethan saw the tremor in the captain's hands as he turned away, and something inside him understood that Hayes had already made his choice. The final phase began at dawn. The team planned to seal the deepest tunnels permanently, neutralizing what they could and entombing the rest beneath reinforced concrete. Hayes led the initial crew inside. Ethan, though ordered to stay back, followed until he reached the entrance, where the cold wind howled like a warning. Hours passed. The radio crackled occasionally with static and brief updates. Then a sharp sound pierced the air. A metallic scream followed by the dull roar of collapsing stone. The ground trembled beneath Ethan's boots. Shouts erupted over the radio, but one voice cut through them all. Hayes's voice, calm and steady amid the chaos, giving one final order to retreat. A moment later, the mountain roared. Dust blasted out of the entrance as the tunnel caved in completely, sending waves of snow and debris cascading down the slope. The noise faded slowly into silence. Ethan ran forward until soldiers held him back, their faces pale in the dim light. The radios hissed, but no further voice came through. For a long time, no one spoke. The mountain stood still once more, its heart sealed beneath tons of rock. By evening, the storm had cleared. The ridge was quiet again, the stars sharp and cold above the wreckage. Ethan sat by the perimeter fence, his hands numb, watching as the crews packed their equipment. Hayes had saved them all, his decision, his sacrifice. Without his command, the detonation of even one unstable device might have destroyed the entire valley. The official report would later describe the event as a controlled collapse, but everyone who had been there knew the truth. Days later, the last of the explosives were removed safely. The operation was declared complete, and the site was marked for permanent closure. As the final trucks departed, Ethan lingered behind. He stood at the base of the mountain where the entrance had been buried once more. The wind carried the faint scent of burnt metal and dust. Somewhere beneath that snow lay the remains of the bunker, and with it the man who had given everything to contain its danger. Ethan whispered a quiet thank you into the wind, though he wasn't sure if it was for Hayes, for the mountain, or for the chance to walk away alive. The silence that followed felt deeper than before, like a heartbeat slowing after years of unrest. The mountain had taken one more soul, and in return, it had given back peace. Months passed before the valley began to feel like itself again. The snow had melted from the lower slopes, revealing the scars left by machines and men. The road that once led to the command site was empty now, blocked by wooden barriers and weathered signs warning of unstable ground. Aspen Creek had returned to its slow rhythm, the townspeople speaking of the incident only in hushed tones. To them, it was another mountain mystery, one more story swallowed by the wind. But for Ethan Miller, it was something that had carved itself into his soul. He still heard the echo of the mountain's collapse in his dreams, and sometimes just before waking, he could almost hear Captain Hayes's voice calling the order to retreat. The sound always ended in silence. When summer came, Ethan hiked back to Silver Pine Ridge. The trail was steeper now, reshaped by rock slides and new growth. He carried no skis this time, only a small pack and a thermos of coffee. The higher he climbed, the more the air seemed to thin and clear, as if the mountain had been purified by its long sleep. Where the bunker once stood, there was only a mound of packed earth and concrete, smooth and silent beneath a layer of moss and snow melt. A narrow wooden fence circled the site, and at its center stood a simple bronze plaque. The words were few. In memory of those who protected us, and those who found what was forgotten. Someone had left a single red stone on top of it. Ethan wondered who, perhaps one of the soldiers. Perhaps no one at all. He knelt beside the plaque, brushing away a thin layer of dust. The air smelled clean, carrying the faint scent of pine sap and cold water. For the first time since the day of the avalanche, he didn't feel the familiar weight in his chest. The guilt that had followed him, the thought that he had brought danger by uncovering the door was finally easing. He realized that maybe it had been meant to happen. The mountain had hidden something deadly, and through him, it had finally been revealed and laid to rest. Hayes' sacrifice, the team's courage, even the fear they'd all felt had become part of the mountain's story, now stitched into its silence. Ethan sat for a long time, watching the clouds drift over the peaks. In the distance, sunlight poured through a gap in the ridge, spreading gold over the valley. He remembered his brother's laughter echoing across the slopes years ago, remembered how the snow used to shimmer under their skis. For a moment, it felt as if the mountain was returning that memory to him, no longer as pain, but as something gentle. He smiled faintly, lifting his face toward the cold breeze. "You'd have liked this place, Noah," he whispered. The wind rose briefly, scattering small flakes of ice that glittered like sparks before fading into the air. On his way down, he passed the tree line and stopped once to look back. The ridge stood quiet, its summit lost in cloud, timeless and unbroken. There was no trace of the machines, no sign of what had once threatened to destroy it. Only the faint hum of the wind moved through the pines. He felt that if he listened closely enough, he might still hear the heartbeat of the buried tunnels far below, not of menace anymore, but of rest. The mountain was at peace, and in that peace he found his own. When Ethan reached the valley floor, the evening light had softened into gold and violet. The town of Aspen Creek shimmered in the distance, small and familiar, the smell of wood smoke rising from the chimneys. He walked the last mile without hurry, his boots crunching over the gravel. For the first time in years, he didn't look back over his shoulder. The mountain would always be there, watching, remembering, holding its secrets beneath the snow. Some mountains kept their silence forever, but this one had finally spoken. And for Ethan Miller, that was enough. Some secrets were meant to stay buried, but now they've been uncovered. What do you think truly lies beneath the mountain? Share your thoughts and tell us where you're watching from. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for the next story.